Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Yet which of Frost's two roads was the one to journey down? Which road was the one leading to health, to well-being, and to wholeness? Which road is the way of wisdom, and which is the way of foolishness? And how will I tell the difference? These are the questions put to all people everywhere, because wherever you live and whoever you are, there are two paths to walk. The path of the wise, the path of the foolish. One will lead to well-being and health and wholeness, capable of nourishing and nurturing and sustaining life. And one leads to division, to brokenness, to self-defeat, to the destruction of life. But how does one person, how does one community of faith, one nation, one tribe, one people know which is the road of wisdom and which is the road of foolishness? And this is what I will be talking about for the rest of this month, today, and for the rest of September. And we will do that even as we celebrate the Reach Work Camp and the enormous support it had from the community of Ontario and the way it impacted the entire community of Ontario and the way it influenced this community of faith of First Presbyterian. For you see, you have arrived at the place in the forest of transition where two roads diverge in the woods. And you will need to know, and you will need to choose one to walk down, because there is only one journey of living wisdom, the wisdom of creating, building, and sustaining community. And you have arrived here at this moment by engaging in the narrative mission study process that encouraged you to think about the symbiotic relationship of the congregation and this Ontario community. You have arrived here by describing the missions this community needs this congregation to do, one of which was the Reach Work Camp, so that the Ontario community may begin healing and looking forward to thriving as a community. You have arrived here by clearly articulating the character and the skills your next pastor will need to lead you into that future that you have described for yourself. You have arrived here because the PNC that you elected is about to actively seek that pastor. You have arrived here because the work camp has happened. And the question is being asked, how does the community build upon the foundation of this work camp to continue to grow into health and wholeness? You have arrived here in this place, in this part of the forest of transition, where you are challenged as a congregation to begin living into the wisdom for sustaining your life, just as every congregation is challenged to live the wisdom for sustaining its life. Just as every person and every family is challenged to live the wisdom for sustaining life. But standing at the point of where two roads diverge, how will this congregation choose the road for the one journey of living wisdom? And I know this sort of sounds simplistic. Might even sound obvious, might sound as sort of like a duh moment. Because it seems the question is so readily answered. But as I look around, I find that the answer seems to still elude so many people, so many leaders, so many nations, so many communities of faith, that the answer may not be as simple as we think it is. It may be that to arrive at that answer, it may be that we need to begin by comprehending the difference between wisdom and foolishness, so we might recognize more clearly the road we are to travel down. And so we begin with the biblical scholar Gerhard von Rad, who wrote in his introduction to the Old Testament, in the days of the Roman Empire, an emperor could not be everywhere in his realm. And so he made little statues, little images of himself that were then erected throughout the realm in order to show that it belonged to the emperor. So too, God has made us the Lord's little images and has placed us all over the face of the earth in order to show that the earth belongs to God. Von Rad reminds us that we do live in a world where there is a tension between two ways of living. Living as wise persons or living as foolish persons. And this is, of course, where the reading from Proverbs that we heard this morning starts us in our journey to understanding the difference between wisdom and foolishness by pointing us out to that one lovely truth that Von Rad has in his little piece. And that is, we're all created by God. It doesn't matter if we're rich or we're poor. It doesn't matter if we're male or female. It doesn't matter if we're Anglo or Hispanic, heterosexual or homosexual, African, Asian, Democrat, Independent, Republican, Libertarian, Green Party, or whatever political party we might be. It doesn't matter. Because we're all created by God. Which is a reminder for me, when I hear that, to go back and take a look at Genesis chapter 1. Because then you recognize that God is not only the creator of all people, but God is the creator of all living beings, from animals to vegetables, from roses to daffodils, from sequoia redwoods to Japanese maple. And that God is also the creator of granite and shale, deep soil and topsoil, oceans and rivers, clouds and stars, air and sun and moon. God is the great gardener who cultivates the soil of creation, the environment of creation, so all living beings may thrive and sustain life. And being wise, as Proverbs tells us, recognizes this and acts in accord with this acknowledgement by being generous and by not despoiling what God has created. See, being wise means being able to recognize what is most important. Being foolish, on the other hand, is failing to recognize or acknowledge this, and treating God's creation with contempt or simply as a tool to increase personal wealth at the expense of the rest of creation. Being foolish is failing to recognize that oppressing the poor and the most vulnerable people will have consequences far beyond the moment of oppression, because God's judgment will fall down on those who oppress them just as surely as the rain does. And yet this is not only about those who are rich and powerful. For the poor also must be wary of falling into the traps of being foolish as well, since being wise and being foolish is no respecter of persons. Because being foolish, you see, is not about situation or station of life. Being foolish is about failing to recognize what is important. And so what is important? Well, let's go back to our friend at Proverbs. Because Proverbs will tell us in keeping with that God created all of us, that God is also the one who brought everyone of the Hebrews and other oppressed people out of Egypt. And that God was the one who provided all that they needed. Being wise also recognizes that the Ten Commandments establishes what is important about thriving as a community of God's people, as it defines the relationships between God and people. God, who is creator, who is liberator, who is the sustainer of life, and who makes provision for that sustaining of life. And the relationship between all the people in the community, so that all will thrive, all will have well-being. The Ten Commandments is not a prescription for segmenting the community between those who are morally pure and those who may not be. And if we go back to those Ten Commandments, we then recognize that being wise also recognizes certain things. And one of those certain things is that every living being needs rest, needs a Sabbath, if it is going to thrive. And it doesn't matter if it's people or animals, soil or air. And I would suspect we can include machines in that, since anyone who's ever run a machine knows that occasionally you just can't run a machine forever. Stuff wears out and gets broken and needs to be cared for. In the same way that so do people, so do animals. Soil and air need a time for rest and recreation. A time to be cared for so that they too will not wear out and break apart. It is also recognizing that the resident alien among us is to be welcomed, because the resident aliens increase the creativity of the community and help sustain the community's life. It is also recognizing that loving your neighbor as yourself is really a call within each person to see the image and likeness of God that is stamped within each one of us from the very beginning of life, and then acting on the basis of that truth. And see, that's what underlies James' question this morning. Why do you think you can act with favoritism to some and treat others with indifference and still claim to trust our Lord Jesus Christ and be His followers? James is not asking a nice, polite question in worship. And he's not using very polite language. If you read the rest of the epistle. His question is a hard question that demands more than just a simple verbal answer from those early Christian communities that he is writing to. For it demands that they take a good, hard look at themselves in the way they are living their lives. Are they really following Jesus Christ or not? Have they really picked up the cross of Christ or not? Are they carrying it as they walk behind Jesus along the long, narrow, stony road that He trod or not? Are they really drinking from the same cup that Christ drank from or not? Or are they clinging to an old way of living based upon the values of the surrounding culture? Are they wise or are they foolish? And for James, this is not a theoretical or intellectual discussion. Rather, it is as real as a congregation that gathers together each week and is as concrete as where people are seated. James sketches the situation with an uncanny conciseness and reveals clearly the dividedness of the community and the dividedness of each person. Here is a community gathered in the place of worship, and two people walk through the front door. One is wearing gold jewelry and fine clothing, and if one wants to think of it, think gold and diamonds and original designer dresses or suits, and is obviously wealthy. The other is shabbily dressed and unkempt and obviously poor. The wealthy person is treated with every worldly honor, invited to come close, sit down in the best seat in the house, be comfortable. What else can we do for you? That you'll hang out with us and stay with us. While the other shabbily dressed person is told, oh, go stand over there somewhere. Please. Go sit over there on the floor. And he is treated with scorn and degradation. Put at a distance, made to stand, or worse yet, made to sit in a position of submission as though he were inferior, as though he were without value or importance. And the time it takes to show favoritism and deference to the rich person while degrading and scorning the poor person in this community has revealed that they may say Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and I will be a faithful disciple, but their actions loudly proclaim their allegiance to the world, of the Roman Empire, its values, its ethics, its way of defining how people will live in relationship with each other. And those relationships were based on a highly stratified society where everyone was put into a little cubbyhole and assigned value as that cubbyhole rose from the bottom to the top. And what James is telling those congregations he's writing to is that they have become fooled when they do that, because they fail to recognize what is most important, what is most valuable. And frankly, Americans and Western cultures are not that far removed from those ancient cultures. Every year, Forbes magazine runs a list of the 400 richest Americans. It never runs a list of the 400 most middle-class Americans. It doesn't run a list of the 400 poorest Americans. They don't even think to ask the question. They don't ask the question about who benefits most from another tax cut. A person with $1 million portfolio or the guy driving the Chevy to work at the GM plant, if the GM plant is still operating, that is. See, our society, like so many societies, is still highly stratified, with distinctions made between people across a broad spectrum, such as between rich and poor, those who have a home and those who are homeless, those who can afford medical care and those who can't. And the church is not immune from making distinctions as well. Whether we talk about the medieval church practice of selling indulgences only to the rich, for those of you who don't know what an indulgence is, it is, as the Episcopal priest who taught me church history in seminary, a get-out-of-hell free card, where the bearer of the card, you see, was guaranteed a pardon for their sins and a quick trip to heaven, while everyone else who didn't have one, well, you'd hover somewhere. And the priest or the bishop who sold that card in the medieval church would then have a tidy sum to keep for themselves. But we still do it today. We still have distinction between sizes of churches. And we also distinguish between pastors of large churches and pastors of other smaller-sized churches. Frank Harrington was the pastor of the Peachtree Presbyterian Church in Atlanta, Georgia. It is one of the largest Presbyterian churches in the United States with about 15,000 members. It is also a fairly wealthy congregation, having the CEO of Coca-Cola and other CEOs of other corporations in its congregation. And Columbia Seminary put together a new building, and it was named after Frank Harrington as well. And Frank Harrington's pictures, matter of fact, his portrait, it's about the size of that one stained glass window, sits in the lobby of this new building. And I know because it was sitting there when I would go there working on my doctoral work. Now, I will tell you that Reverend Harrington was an excellent pastor. He was a renowned preacher whose sermons were taped and sold widely. But when he died, nearly an entire issue of Monday Morning, a magazine for Presbyterian pastors, was devoted to him, to his life, to his work, to everything he had done. And the next month, many people wrote letters to the magazine saying how important a pastor and preacher Frank Harrington had been for them, and that certainly he deserved to have a building built at Columbia as a monument to his memory and his ministry. But there was one letter I took note of that spoke about the death, within a few days of Frank Harrington's death, of a Presbyterian pastor who served a small rural Alabama church for over 30 years. And this pastor preached every Sunday, visited people in their homes and hospitals, did weddings and funerals, taught and baptized children and adults, ministered the Lord's Supper. And at the end of the letter, the writer asked, "Where is the building dedicated to this pastor? When will there be a magazine dedicated to his life? Wasn't he as valuable and important a pastor and a person as Frank Harrington?" Those who are wise know what is most important and valuable. Those who are wise know the answer to those questions. Those who are foolish do not even understand the question. Amen.